Now we want to move on to talk about chapter 4, which is about the consumption, savings, and investment. So to begin with, we want to discuss what is consumers' behavior. You may say, hey, wait a minute, this is the macro class. Why we still want to talk about consumers' behavior? Well, there are two reasons. The first reason is that when we want to look at the behavior of a nation related to consumption and savings, we need to add up the behavior of an individuals. Therefore, once we understand the behavior of individuals, we can add them up and then we understand what is the behavior of a nation. So we are not too far away from the perspective of macroeconomics. The second reason is that if we can assume that all the individuals are exactly the same, which is in fact a lot of the assumptions that we made when we are doing macro analysis using a model. So then once we understand the consumer's behavior for one individual, given that everyone is exactly the same, then the behavior of one individual will represent the behavior of a nation. So that's why we want to talk about the consumer's behavior here, even though our focus is to look at the consumption and saving decisions of a nation. Before I start, I want to clarify a term that I use quite a lot interchangeably. We say that we talk about the consumer's behavior. Sometimes I say it is about the household's behavior. Sometimes I say it is the individual's behavior. They are meaning the same thing. Individuals, consumers, and household means the same thing. As long as the economy have all the agents exactly the same, one individual will represent by one household, and they are representing as one consumer, and the behavior of that represents the behavior of a nation. So then, we want to first talk about the decision of consumption and savings for the consumers. The consumption in here refers to what we eat today or nowadays. So sometimes we call it the current consumption. In notations, we will write it as the C. The C is representing the consumption. The superscript represents current. If it is a two-periods model, we can say that the current consumption can be characterized by C1. And then what is the savings? The savings in here is something that eventually will be used anyway in the future. You are not going to save for your kids because in this simple context, we are not talking about different generations. So then once you save, for sure you need to eat it someday, otherwise it is a waste. So then the savings in fact is related to future consumption, and in notations sometimes we'll rewrite it as the CF and C2. For CF, the superscript F referring to future. So again, for C2 is that if it is only a two-period model, then the savings will be for future use. The future for a two-period model will be the second period, so we write it as C2. Even though in here I write the 1 and 2 for C1 and C2 as the subscripts, but it doesn't matter if you choose to write it as a superscript. Now, let me give you an example. You can imagine that if you are the only one on an island, for example, if you were Robinson Crusoe that somehow are left alone on an island due to a shipwreck, then you somehow find a coconut tree and there are 100 coconuts on top of the tree today. You can choose to eat all of them today. You can also choose to only eat some of them today and save it for another day. For example, you can choose to eat only 60 coconuts today and then save the remaining 40 for future use. So once you save the 40 coconuts, you definitely want to eat it. You are not going to save it for nothing. So then when we talk about consumption, the consumption is about current consumption. When we talk about savings, it is referring to future consumption. So then we say if the current consumption is less than the current income, then it means that our saving is positive. If the current consumption is greater than the income, it means that the saving is negative, and we have a name for that, which is called dis-savings. So if you are on an island by yourself, there's no way you can consume more than your income, because in order to consume more than your income, you need to borrow from someone. So once we understand that whenever we save, in fact, it is for future use or future consumption, we want to introduce a tendency of individual for related to consumption and saving behavior that is about the desire of consumption smoothing. What does it mean, consumption smoothing? It means that we have a tendency to eat roughly equal amount at each period. We do not want to eat all of our income today and have nothing to eat tomorrow. So then let me give you two examples. The first example is related to our earlier example about Robinson Crusoe. On an island, you somehow seize 100 coconuts. Due to the tendency of the consumption smoothing, you will not eat all the 100 coconuts in a day. You are going to eat some of them and save it for the other day. If you know that you are going to stay on the islands for 2 days, then you probably will want to eat 50 coconuts today and then another 50 coconuts tomorrow. And that is the desire of consumption smoothing. The second example I want to talk about is related to mooncake. So imagine that you receive a box of mooncakes which contains 10 mooncakes. The expiration date, in fact, will be in 10 days. Will you choose to eat 10 mooncakes in a day, or you will prefer to open it up and eat it for 10 days and eat one each day? Well, I believe that for most of you, as a rational individual, you are going to choose to eat only one mooncake each day. And then you will feel happier than you eat 10 mooncakes in a day. So for that behavior, we call that is the desire of consumption smoothing. And when we are developing a model related to consumption and savings, we want to incorporate this behavior into the model. So now we understand the behavior of an individual related to consumption and saving decisions. Then now we want to add them up and see what happened from a nation's perspective. In here, we want to focus on a closed economy. So if you may recall from what we learned earlier about the national income identity, we know that the output equals consumption plus investment plus the government expenditure plus the net export. Given that it is a closed economy, so we can cross out the net exports. And then what we are going to get in here is that the total output equals the consumption plus the investment plus the government expenditure. From this equation, we know that when we have some income, it's for sure for consumptions. That is for household consumption, which is represented by the private consumption of C, and the other is represented by the government's consumption, that is the government expenditure G. But then how does the investment related to savings? Well, as you may recall from our earlier discussion, we said that the private saving and the government saving equals the investment plus the net export and the net factor payment from abroad. Again, given that in here we assume it is a closed economy, so we can cross out the net exports and the net factor payment from abroad and assume it is zero. And then so the investment equals the private savings and the government savings. So now we can rewrite this equation. We say that the national income will equal the consumption of the private sector plus the government expenditure plus the saving of the private sector and the governments. And then the consumption here will be the desired consumption by household, and then the savings in here will be the desired savings by the nations. So then from this equation, we can clearly see that from a nation's perspective, the behavior of the consumption and savings are exactly the same as the behavior of an individual. When a nation receives certain amounts of the income, or when a nation produces certain amount of the output, it is either for the consumption or for savings, which is for future use. And for sure, when we look at the consumption and savings decision of a nation, it also persists the property of the consumption smoothing. And we will illustrate that under a model later on. So this is the end of today's lecture.